Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have Maria Chester with us again. Welcome again, Maria. Could you reintroduce yourself?
Thank you. Maria Chester, Vice President of Operations at GuideStar here.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, please.
No, happy to be here.
And Maria, remind everyone, what does GuideStar do?
We are a third-party vendor that assists hospitals and health systems nationwide with clinical trial processing and research consulting.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
So you are the better version of site networks and that type of product. Is that the updated version that doesn't have many of the old problems? Is that fair or is that unfair?
That's very fair. Basically, We are the physician and research staff advocate to get their trials up and running efficiently, A, and B, in the best interest of the physicians and patients.
Exactly. Now, we had a very brief conversation just before we got onto the recording on COVID. And that I like to think that it was, shall we say, illuminating. So let's start with the news. The news was that the UK just approved its COVID vaccine. My first question to you, Maria, as someone who is on the ground floor doing research, and I'm not going to say whether or not you're doing any research in COVID, that may or may not be confidential, but doing research, what is your opinion on UK's approval? Is the first in the world. So what is your take on that?
It is, and I do think my gut says it's a bit premature. And again, I know that, we've been in quarantine for many, many months, and we've suffered losses of all kinds worldwide. So we need to move to a treatment. I just, from a research background, we need to really do due diligence in knowing that the benefit outweighs the risk, number one. And, number two, with the issue of, durability post-vaccine, is it really there when we don't really have any sort of long-term data whatsoever to kind of go from?
So you use the word durability. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Meaning that, the effect to remain impervious to COVID at least 90 days out from the second vaccine injection.
So Moderna, I believe Moderna said theirs works for 90 days at least. Is that
exactly? That was the newest kind of thing in the last few days.
So my question to you is this basically where we're going, where we start having to take COVID vaccinations every 90 days or so, and therefore, like every quarter we all go in, we get a new vaccine, or do you think that this is just a temporary glitch, and we'll get back to normal, if you will?
It is, and I think the reaction would be, well, at least we can vaccinate everyone to have a 90-day durability. But then, of course, the question is, like other medications, if we continue to dose, do we see increased toxicities with cumulative dosing? And, all those other questions that come into it. Cost, obviously, is insurance going to pay for all of us worldwide? Can't go get every 90 days vaccine. So, it kind of leads to 1,000,001 questions, all of which, definitely need to be answered. I hate to kind of jump into this prematurely and then see any sort of long-term toxicities, especially giving the vaccine to healthy patients that wouldn't otherwise, have these things.
So what I think about is, I don't know if you heard, I'm sure you heard about this already, but the CDC came out with initial recommendations on who should get the vaccine.
Sure.
My question is, if you've got these initial recommendations, you're barely going to start scratching the surface in 90 days. To then say, now go back and give the same people the vaccine again because it doesn't work past 90 days. What happens then?
Yeah. And, you're giving it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you want to give it to the elderly, the young, and but then, those are the people where if there are any toxicities we don't know about yet or what have you, they're really going to have issues. But then again, you don't want to give it to a healthy person either and really have the risk outweigh the benefits. So, it's a tough one.
Let's flip that around. Can you imagine giving this to all your healthcare providers and they're going, I'm sick now?
Yes.
and there's no one left to help. Like
to take care. Yeah.
yeah,
Who's going to be the workforce? Because as you know, I mean, we already have burnout, as an RN.
Yeah. Exactly.
So many of my colleagues still at the bedside are just, exhausted mentally and physically.
So here's my next question. So let's assume that we have a vaccine that is potentially going to work. What is your take on the UK actually saying, like, you know what, we're a single country, but we know that this is going to work for us? You described it as premature. What made you think, like, what makes you think that the data itself would be premature? Again, we don't know. We haven't looked at the data, so we're really just going off of what our gut tells us. So let's put that disclaimer out there.
Exactly. And I mean, obviously, I'm not privy to direct knowledge about this. I'm just kind of like you, who does a lot of reading and kind of looking into this. To my knowledge, the full data analysis has not yet been done for those studies. And so I think one of them had 14,500, research participants. Kind of what I want to know out of those is, when were they first vaccinated? What's the longest follow-up that we do have? Let's just say that kind of post-March when we flew into all of this, if they've started in April, it doesn't leave us too much follow-up data, even if they kind of got up and running very quickly.
Right.
So, again, it just hesitancy on my part for, the safety and even if it's efficacious for the 90 days.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit because it raises these questions of, obviously there was over the last 9 months or so, this giant push to get something out there.
Yeah.
Have you seen other protocols where there have been giant pushes in the US? And is there sort of a spillover effect from the research being done on COVID to research being done outside COVID?
I've not seen in my career where something was this expedited. Obviously, even in some of our really positive oncology studies, and there's we kind of push through because we see how efficacious it is. It still obviously always will err on the side of caution. And that's kind of where I just want to make sure that that's not being missed in pushing through COVID. But again, I know the other thing is, if we could, prevent one person out of the 100,000, dying, then it's kind of worth it. But again, are we causing harm to some others as well? So,
yeah,
we seem to be pretty good at managing it, fortunately. At least in the U.S., where unfortunately we still have deaths, obviously, but I think physicians, in their brilliance and kind of clinical experience, are being better at treating it and kind of getting on top of it. And I think as patients become more knowledgeable, we all have to, deal with this and live through it. Maybe they're being treated sooner than initially, and, so maybe that's helping with the overall morbidity, et cetera. So,
but I guess I'm referring more to the actual processes. I know that NIH has come out and they've talked about a process where they're expediting the research, and there are other organizations, other groups that are doing the same thing. Do you think there are lessons that are being translated on how to do research faster and potentially cheaper? I don't know if it'd be cheaper or not. I'd be curious.
I don't think from a cost perspective, that kind of changes doing it in a more accelerated manner or starting the trial in a more accelerated manner. I think, perhaps that piece is slightly improved, but as far as going through the, FDA approval process, that's what certainly from my perspective is different, like I said, even from other positive studies. I think, much more so expedited. And again, I understand the rationale for that. I've just not experienced that before. And, I guess we'll kind of have to see with the UK kind of moving forward first, although we are ensued to kind of start by the end of December, it seems.
Are we really? I missed that part. Interesting.
Yeah, I know a lot of hospitals, even locally here in the New Orleans area, are kind of anticipating by the end of December having at least doses for healthcare employees. So
I can just imagine like people walking around and healthcare employees being comfortable walking out and everyone else being really, really jealous. Do you think that there might be some social follow through because healthcare employees got pushed ahead of the line?
I don't think so much for healthcare employees, but I do think since we're on a global scale here, I do think that, and I know I already see this kind of on social media. It's like, why is UK starting first? Should be the US, and I feel like it's going to be like that. Why is India being dosed? Why, It's kind of pointing fingers. Everybody wants to be the first.
Do they? Until they don't.
Exactly, until they don't. Yeah. Well, you have the new shiny toy and I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. Until you find out that a shiny toy contains arsenic. But
yes.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that's not the problem here, or there's no problem at all. So I'm wishing the best for the UK, quite honestly, and I'm sure you are as well. It's just,
absolutely. I hope I'm wrong about, kind of not wanting to rush into this so much, and that it's an absolute blockbuster and everyone, does exceedingly well,
right,
and has long-term immunity.
So let's sort of take that next step and ask that next question that goes along with it. Did you follow what happened with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine?
No.
So what was an interesting piece, what happened was that they put out some, so as I'm sure you noticed a few weeks ago, there was, I'm making up dates here, but on Monday, Moderna goes, we have a vaccine that's 90% effective.
Yeah.
And I think Pfizer came out and said, we have a vaccine that's 95% effective.
Correct.
And like on Thursday, AstraZeneca comes out and goes, we have a vaccine that's 96% effective. And you're like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. Until someone looked at the data and said, are you sure, AstraZeneca? Because these numbers don't line up. And it turns out that they made some mistakes in their data and in the data collection. And they said, well, our point still stands, but maybe it wasn't, we may have rushed through the analysis a little bit. So the question for you is, what is the impact you think on the public? As someone who does clinical research, do you think that these mistakes happen? Or is this, everyone was trying to push their numbers and their values through the roof and AstraZeneca just got caught up in it? Or as someone who works with clinical research, this is just normal. And you know what? We learn and we move on.
I don't think it's normal. And that's exactly what I'm speaking to, where it's kind of the haste makes waste.
Yeah.
And trying to push through so much that you're not double and triple checking, which is, so vital, obviously, in this space. So, that's exactly what I worry about. We do usually err on the side of precaution, all of us. And, the sites double and triple check, pharma double and triple check, then the FDA does the same thing. And so I think there is a little, a very little error margin, if you will, whereas when you're really expediting to this level, on this huge scale, obviously, you're just more apt to make an error when everyone's not being able to triple check and kind of have the time to work through all the data.
So that raises the other question, which is, if you're not double and triple checking, the impact is that you're potentially going to have multiple vaccines on the market, all of which are, and again, these are just 3 companies, and I know there's several more working through their own vaccines.
Sure.
The big issue that's also popped up is the idea that these vaccines, for the most part, need to be refrigerated, and they need to be controlled. The entire distribution process needs to be controlled. From an ethical perspective, the impact of this is going to be that several countries literally are going, we can't have this vaccine because we don't have a cold supply chain. So we don't have the ability to transport this vaccine the way it needs to be transported.
Sure.
How do you, as a clinician, well, you're both a clinician and also a person who works in clinical research, but in both those roles, from an ethical perspective, do you think it's concerning And what is your sort of take on that, if you will?
Oh, it is concerning. I mean, operationalizing everyone getting the 1 or 2 doses would be a huge feat, globally. But then again, especially with kind of the seeds being planted of this 90-day duration, if we would have to be, dosed kind of on a consistent basis, or even an annual basis, kind of like the flu vaccine is now, how we would all do that globally. I mean, that's a good question. Obviously, there will be, several countries as a whole that probably have a hard time participating. And then even, within that, it's, only the privileged who have healthcare can get there. I mean, yeah, that brings in the whole ethical thing. But then if you don't, vaccinate everyone, are you really helping the whole? So it's a conundrum, no doubt. And it'll be interesting how we can kind of move through this. Like I said, even if we do find out that there is more durability than we think now, and we do only need that kind of initial dosing. So
that sort of raises the question of, and I'm going to sort of pivot a little bit, and I don't usually get into these topics, so feel free to educate me if you know more about this than I do. But there's a concept out there on social determinants of health. Have you heard of that before?
No.
Okay, so the idea is that where you were born and where you grow up has a major impact on how healthy you will be through your life.
Sure.
That if you grow up in a rural, poor town, you'll have less access to health. That has its own impact on whether you get the appropriate kind of healthcare as you continue. And usually social determinants of health is usually a new concept that's sort of popping up, that people are still trying to understand this properly. But the impact of that is, in the US, there are large swaths of people, and I don't know if you can call people swaths, but large groups of people, if you will, who don't have appropriate access, if you will, to healthcare. But what happens when you start talking about this globally and you're talking about entire countries being having lack of access to healthcare? In those situations, do you end up in a scenario where the US is open, the UK is open, Germany is open, but Thailand isn't, and Vietnam isn't, and India isn't? And does that create a list of haves and have-nots, and therefore increase not only health inequality, but wealth inequality? And what is the impact of that as you continue? So I'd love to sort of get your perspective.
I absolutely think that, that's a potential, as I was mentioning, with, whole countries not being able to operationalize something, so intense as this. And then within that country, you're exactly right. Do only the elite kind of get it, or the educated ones who have established healthcare in general? What about your rural farmers in Thailand and, southern India and those kind of places? What happens? It'll be interesting to see even, restrictions as we kind of hopefully, increase movement and travel and those things. If those kind of countries, we still have to maintain, if you visit there, you still have to quarantine there, and when you return and all those other pieces. But, minority-based healthcare and the have-nots, as you mentioned, it's always a challenge, even in our regular indications that, trying to diagnose hypertension and diabetes kind of early on. And, when you don't have the access to healthcare, you also don't have that kind of rapport and trust factor. Mm-hmm. And that's the other piece that I worry about kind of moving too quickly, is you want to make sure that, no one kind of loses that fundamental faith of you are doing the double and triple checking. So when I'm sending my daughter to be vaccinated, I can feel confident that it's going to do more benefit than harm. So, that's the other piece to that is.
Have you ever watched this movie? I think it was called Elysium, from Matt Damon. Did you ever watch that?
No.
Okay. It was this movie with this basis that there's a floating satellite in the sky, and everyone who lives in the satellite is super rich, super powerful, has loads of money. And then there's Earth, and Earth is just excuse my language, but they're a shit show. Okay. And the idea is that they have no access to health or anything like that. And every so often, people from Elysium would come down, and they would they would sort of walk around around the earth at that point. And the idea would be that people would kind of not like them because of the fact that they had more access, more stuff than they did. My question is, does this, as we continue into a COVID world with countries not getting access, can you imagine the wealthy tourists going, you know what, I want to go to Bali right now.
Yeah.
And I can. And what is the implication of that as we continue, where these wealthy tourists are able to travel to Bali and the people in Bali are serving them, but they can't leave their own houses. So I find that to be fascinating as we continue.
It is fascinating, and it's kind of heartbreaking to think about. But yeah, God, I wish I had the answer.
Maria, this was really, really good. Thank you for coming on. I'd love to do more with you, but I know you have a little bit of a time restriction, but any closing thoughts?
Not really. I will be looking at the data. I would love to, come back and discuss this further as we kind of see things, at least regarding COVID. But yeah, certainly any clinical research topic, pick my brain anytime. And thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you again.
All right. Take care.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.